Before America existed, before Europe ruled the world, before kings carved their names into stone and called it history, slavery already controlled human life. It did not begin with ships crossing the Atlantic, and it did not belong to one race, one religion, or one nation. Slavery existed the moment the first human group realized it could overpower another and force them to work. That single realization changed humanity forever, and once that door opened, it never truly closed. The oldest clay tablets ever discovered, pulled from the soil of ancient Mesopotamia, already describe human beings treated as property. They record laws regulating slaves, debt bondage, and captives taken in war. By the time humans learned to write, slavery was already ancient. It wasn't hidden, and it wasn't controversial. It was simply how the world worked. That alone should make us pause, because it means slavery wasn't an accident of history. It was a foundation of civilization itself. In ancient Egypt, long before Moses was born, foreign captives were marched into quarries and mines. They built the wealth and monuments of pharaohs who believed their authority came directly from the gods. Chains didn't just build pyramids. Chains reinforced the idea that power was divine, and resistance was rebellion against heaven itself. Slavery wasn't only economic. It was spiritual, political, and psychological. Across the Indus Valley, early Indian kingdoms described rigid social divisions that eventually hardened into the caste system. Entire families were locked into service roles from birth. Children inherited their parents' status with no chance to rise, no escape, and no appeal. You didn't become a slave, you were born one. Your future was decided before you could speak. In ancient China during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, war captives and criminals were branded, bought, sold, and passed down as property. Entire households could be enslaved for generations. Their names were stripped away and replaced with the identity of their owners. Once enslaved, history forgot who they were. Only ownership mattered. In Greece, slaves worked the silver mines under conditions so brutal most never lived long enough to see freedom. In Rome, slavery reached a scale few modern people can comprehend. At the height of the empire, nearly a third of Italy's population was enslaved. Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Jews, anyone conquered by Roman legions could be marched home in chains. And in Rome, as in many ancient societies, the children of slaves were automatically born slaves. Slavery wasn't temporary punishment, it was hereditary fate. Across Africa, long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon, powerful kingdoms took captives from rival tribes. Sometimes they were used for labor, sometimes for sacrifice, sometimes for trade. Slavery was not foreign to Africa before Europeans arrived. It was woven into political power, military strategy, and economic survival. These were not small tribal customs. These were organized systems run by kings and councils. In the Middle East, the rise of Islam did not erase slavery. It regulated it. Quranic verses spoke directly about captives, the rights of slaves, and the conditions under which they could be freed. The Arab slave trade would last more than 1,000 years, moving millions of Africans, Persians, Slavs, Greeks, and others across vast distances. Some boys were taken from the Horn of Africa, castrated, and sold for prices far higher than ordinary slaves. This was not a side effect of history. It was an industry. In the Americas, long before Columbus ever set sail, many native tribes took captives in war. Some were adopted, some were traded, some were tortured, and some became hereditary slaves within the conquering tribe. Among the Aztecs, slaves were sold in marketplaces as routinely as food. In the Andes, the Inca enforced a labor tax that required a massive portion of adult males to work for the empire in agriculture, mining, and construction. Slavery in the Americas was not rare. It was normal. Every corner of the earth has its own version of this story. Every civilization has records of who wore the chains and who held them. Slavery was not invented by the West. It was not created by Europeans, and it was not limited to any one race. Slavery did not disappear after the ancient world. It evolved. It scaled. It became global. And long before the Atlantic slave trade ever existed, massive slave systems were already fully operational. In the marshlands of southern Iraq, in the year 869 AD, 500,000 African slaves rose up against the Abbasid Caliphate in one of the largest slave rebellions in human history. These men had been brought from East Africa to harvest sugarcane under conditions so brutal that most didn't survive more than a few years. Their revolt lasted 14 years. Entire cities were destroyed. Tens of thousands died. And when the rebellion was finally crushed, the slave trade continued as if nothing had happened. Under Islamic empires stretching from Baghdad to Cairo to Zanzibar, slaves flowed across the Indian Ocean world. Nubians, Ethiopians, Persians, Slavs, Greeks. Markets moved human beings in numbers the world would not see again until the rise of the Atlantic system. From there, slavery moved north into the Mediterranean. Slavic villagers were routinely captured by nomadic groups north of the Black Sea and funneled into slave markets serving both Christian and Islamic empires. African kingdoms expanded these systems further. In West Africa, entire states built their power on slave raiding. Victories in war were measured not only in territory but in captives. Before Europeans entered the market, a significant portion of West Africa's population already lived in some form of servitude. These were not isolated practices. They were institutional. Then came the Barbary states. From the 1500s to the 1800s, pirate fleets raided European coastlines as far north as Iceland. Men, women, and children were dragged into slavery. Over 3 centuries, more than 1 million Europeans were enslaved. Italians, Spaniards, Dutch, Greeks, Irish, even Americans. When the USS Philadelphia ran aground in 1803, its entire crew was enslaved. That single event triggered America's first foreign war, fought not over land or wealth, but to stop the enslavement of its citizens. By the time Europeans arrived on the West African coast, the machinery of bondage was already everywhere. The world did not discover slavery in the Atlantic. The Atlantic inherited it. What made the Atlantic slave trade different was not the concept of slavery itself, but the world it collided with. For the first time, slavery entered an age of global navigation, industrial shipping, and written bureaucracy. European nations did not invent the slave ship, but they were the first to scale it globally. Between the 1500s and 1800s, roughly 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. About 10.5 million survived the journey. But here is the part most people are never taught. The vast majority did not go to the United States. Nearly 5 million were sent to Brazil. Another 4 million were taken to Caribbean plantations. Only a small fractions, roughly 3 to 4%, were brought to what became the United States. So what made this system feel different? It wasn't brutality. Other systems were just as cruel. It wasn't scale. Other trades lasted longer and moved comparable numbers. And it wasn't the idea that one group enslaved another. That was the story of the entire world. The real differences were time, documentation, and proximity. The Atlantic system ended in 1865. That's only a few generations ago. And unlike earlier systems, it left behind paperwork, names, ages, prices, ship manifests, pain you could trace. People often say the Atlantic slave trade was entirely about race. But if it were, there would never have been free black people. Yet there were thousands. Some bought their freedom. Some were born free. Some owned land, and some even owned slaves. Slavery followed profit first. Ideology came later. Economics created loopholes, and slavery exploited them. For thousands of years, slavery survived everything humanity threw at it. Empires rose and fell, religions formed and split, borders shifted, languages died. Slavery remained. Until one civilization finally said it was not just unfortunate, not just tradition, but morally wrong. That shift began in Britain, which outlawed the slave trade and spent enormous resources trying to suppress it. Other nations followed slowly. But the most violent reckoning happened in the United States. By the mid-1800s, America was torn in half. One side moving away from slavery, the other doubling down on it. When war came, it was catastrophic. More than 600,000 people died. Nearly 500,000 of them were white Americans fighting to preserve the nation and end slavery. It was the single largest sacrifice any nation had ever made to abolish its own slave system. Even then, the world did not move together. Slavery continued in parts of the world well into the 20th century. The West did not invent slavery, but it was the first civilization to repeatedly declare it wrong and enforce that belief with laws, ships, diplomacy, and blood. Today, most people only know one chapter of this story, not because the others don't exist, but because history stopped being taught and started being curated. When the story is shrunk, the result isn't clarity, it's distortion. and distortion divides people. Because once you understand the full history, the narrative of one eternal villain and one eternal victim collapses. Every civilization has blood on its hands. Every people has ancestors who suffered and ancestors who enslaved. That truth is uncomfortable, but it is also unifying. Because it means suffering was universal. And when suffering is universal, it cannot be weaponized. So the real question isn't why slavery existed. The question is why we are only taught part of the story. Who decides which suffering matters? And who benefits when humanity forgets that it all walked through the same fire? Because a divided public is easy to control. And if people ever learned the full truth, they might stop fighting each other and start questioning the ones who keep rewriting the story.